Now we're going to talk about cost estimating and cost-benefit analysis, clearly directed towards what we've talked about in terms of procurement and contracting and those sorts of things. And you're going to be asked at some point to do something like this to figure out, hey, is the cost of this for this statement of work justified? And how do you do that, especially when we're talking about an acquisition process where early on in the cycle, it's very vague. We don't quite know what we're doing yet. How do you put a cost on that? So we're going to talk about that in some detail of how it's been done in the past, and that this is actually a more robust discipline than you might have even thought. I want to note that this slide deck is adapted from Professor Dan Nussbaum in the OR department, this is really his expertise. So you should know that if this is something you need to know more about, there's a great resource there in the Ops Research Department. He's really world-class at doing this. So we'll start by talking about a little background, what, why, who. We'll talk about how DoD thinks about this, and then we'll get into the specifics of cost-benefit analysis. So first you should know that cost estimating is a well-developed discipline. We've been doing it for a long, long time. It also has very high visibility. You'll see an org chart later on where there's cost estimation that's going right into the Secretary of Defense's office. So at the very highest level, everybody's worried about cost overruns, being able to estimate things tightly. But we still misestimate and sometimes very badly, and so maybe we should talk about why we do that. So what is cost analysis? Really what we're doing is we're collecting and analyzing historical data. It's got to be historical. I mean, it's got to be stuff that happened in the past or we can't collect it, right? And we're going to apply quantitative models to be able to predict future costs based on historical data. So we use the past to predict the future. And sometimes we're good at it and sometimes we're not. And we can only do it based on whatever information is available at that time. We can break it up into parts. But there's a very clear purpose behind this. We want to be able to translate what you said you wanted into budget requirements. And this is what makes everything work, is making sure that dollars are flowing and at the right level of dollars are flowing and that predictable dollars are flowing. So we want to be able to communicate a realistic view of the likely cost outcome. That's what this is all about. Just to give you an idea of, this is at the platform level, so we're not doing this sort of work in our line of business, but you can imagine a major training system of many, many millions of dollars versus a small part task trainer or analysis tool or what have you that might be less than $1 million to procure. You've got production time, you've got lead time, that is the things that you're spending before you actually enter the acquisition cycle. Then you've got production time in years and the number of dollars. This can vary wildly. This is really important because this is a decision maker's tool. So we gotta help make decisions on the viability structure, resource requirements. We got to be able to defend our budgets. We have to be able to assess change. One of the things that we all get hammered into our heads early on is that the cost to change goes up through the acquisition cycle. Change costs are cheap if you get them early. They're expensive if you get them late. So these are things we worry about. We want to do analysis of alternatives. It's very reasonable to ask any of us, hey, what are the alternatives to what you say you want to do? What if we did nothing? What would happen? What if we just repurposed that other thing and that's cheaper? What if we did that? We want to do source selection. This has to do with costs. We want to perform design trade-offs. We also have to comply with public law. We talked about in contracting about our obligation to the private sector to be fair and equitable and how we deal with them. Well, a lot of that is cost estimation. Oversight requirements. These are all things that all fit into cost estimating. It's pervasive. It touches everything we do. So the idea of cost is not a uniquely defined term. You can't just say, what's the cost? That doesn't mean anything to anybody. There's overhead costs, which is the costs of things that aren't what you're actually paying for. It's the cost of creating the capability so that you can do it. There's sunk costs. That's money that's already been spent. There's opportunity costs. If I'm spending my resources doing A, I'm not spending my opportunity, my resources getting ready to do B. There's life cycle costs. There's fixed costs versus variable, direct, indirect. These are all words that you need to know something about, at least know approximately what they mean. So there's some standard methodologies. We won't talk about all of these, but one of the things we're going to do is we're going to do an analogy. We're going to talk about, hey, what's it going to cost to do that thing that you want to do? And you say, well, we've never done it before, but it's kind of like this, and that we'll use that to estimate our cost. We could do something parametric. This is the reason why Dan Nussbaum is over in the Operations Research Department, because this is what those folks do. Apply statistical methods, we look at patterns, we look at statistical inferences. This is a common tool in cost estimation. What about build-up? So a bottom-up. Let's cut it into parts. Let's estimate the cost of each of the parts as we build up the whole. And then what about expert opinion? So none of these other methods are going to apply to this thing I want to do. Can I just get some experts to eyeball this thing and say, hey, approximately, what do you think this is going to cost, just based on your experience? So we talk about analogy as it's like one of these. So I've got an old system. It's an F100. It's got a certain level of thrust. It's got a cost. I've got the new system. It's going to have more thrust. Can I just estimate the cost based on that? So you want to know, hey, how much of the cost is related to the engine size and the thrust? You need to know that, because it's not going to be $5.2 million. It's going to be something different. How different is dependent on the relationship between cost and the variables you're measuring. So you might want to have, an adjusted analogy is kind of like a regression, but you're just guessing at the slope. In an adjusted analogy is, by definition, estimating outside the range of the data. So remember, the data is the stuff in the past. You're looking at the future. So parametric estimating is where you're looking at a pattern. So here we're looking at a bunch of data points for programs that are kind of like what it is we want to do, and we're just going to kind of lay a regression. We're just going to say, hey, according to these two variables, and I'm not saying what these two variables are, I've got a horizontal and a vertical, but according to these two variables, look, that purple line there kind of suggests that there's a linear relationship. So if I can estimate what those two numbers are going to be for my new product, I should be able to estimate the cost, making a statistical inference. But this gets pretty complicated, because usually I don't have two variables. I might have 10 variables, 20 variables, 100 variables. So I can look at regression as a model building tool. Here I've got 115 different car types, and I've got what does it say here? I've got their MPG city, their weight, their cargo, their seating, their horsepower, their displacement. I can take all these things and I can build a model, and I can predict something that I want to predict based on historical data of existing vehicles. But then you got to be careful, because weight could be a good predictor, but horsepower is a good predictor too. Can we use them both? Should I use one? Should I use the other? What are some other factors that I should use to determine what the estimated cost of this new thing might actually be? Now these are some real slides that we're borrowing from the Army for this briefing, but just looking at a weight-based methodology. So I'm looking at weight, I'm looking at a bunch of historical data points, and I'm trying to make an estimate on what is the relationship between weight, the relationship between weight and cost in this case. But that's too simple, so I start to then look at, let's lay these things out along a timeline. And so let's look at the first year of production, if that's used as a proxy for technology advancement. So when the car came out, how far along were we in technology advancement? You start to see a trend. You start to be able to put a line through this thing, and I can start to say, okay, now if I can guess these things for my new product, I can start to predict the future. And here what I do is once I've created my model that's creating a relationship between multiple variables with the existing data, now I can start to muse on new fictitious vehicles or potential vehicles using these dummy variables and look at what might a vehicle like this look like, what might a vehicle like that look like, and what might the cost be, the associated cost of those things be. Once you've created a model, you can use it lots of times, not just once. We also know something about how to conduct risk analysis to identify key cost variables. So you've got these cost drivers like labor rates. What does it cost to get engineers to work on this? The cost of your materials, inflation, economic conditions. So these things we can't control them, but they're going to drive our costs. And you've got technical drivers. So these are design decisions, things like that. And then on the other side, you've got schedule drivers. So when are we going to need this thing? Can we be aggressive? Can we be relaxed? How are we going to execute? So these things fit together in predictable relationships that allow you to estimate your risk, and the risk relates to how confident you're going to be in that cost estimate. Some things you can control, some things you can't. So you learn something about strategic planning that use some of the very same principles of knowing the difference between what is likely to be stable and what is likely to be variable. So now we're going to get very lightly into the mechanics of cost estimating, or I should say the organizational level of cost estimating. So you've got pieces of it that are at the department level, the OSD level, the different services, and then you've got mission level. So you've got, depending on what the mission actually is, you've got your folks that are experts within those domains that do cost estimation. This is a slide I was referring to earlier where there you've got, all the way up at the Secretary of Defense level, you've got a Director of Cost Analysis and Program Evaluation as a direct report right into SecDef's office. So this is taken very seriously. And of course, cost analysis goes everywhere else in this slide as well. All these programs are doing cost estimation, but there's sort of a top dog all the way at the top, because nothing's going to happen if we can't cost estimate reasonably well. We're not going to be able to function. So we touched earlier on this issue of analysis of alternatives. We all do this all the time. You do it in your home. You do it when you're estimating whether you should buy something new, whether you should fix the old thing. You need to do the same thing in your job, where you're looking at a procurement, looking at what your alternatives, your logical alternatives might actually be, and then doing rough cost estimation on those, on what makes the most sense. This is just a standard part of what we should be doing. And so now we're getting into cost-benefit analysis, which is part of analysis of alternatives. So you've got the costs that are the quantifiable and non-quantifiable costs of a procurement or whatever it is you're actually going to do. And then on the other side would be the benefits, right? So what are the quantifiable, non-quantifiable benefits of doing this thing? And you want to weigh those things out. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Then you're likely going to want to do it. And this is how, when you do analysis of alternatives, you're doing cost-benefit analysis on the alternatives, and therefore you'll determine what your best option might actually be. And this is maybe kind of stating the obvious, that, but it forces you to think about not drifting off the original question, which is, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? You want to make sure you don't start considering alternatives that don't actually address the problem, because that's not really an alternative. Or if something is only a partial solution, it has to be marked as such and considered as such, so it's not fully compared to something that's a complete solution to the problem. These are maybe some obvious things, but why do you want to do cost-benefit analysis? You want to make sure you're a good steward of public money. You want to make sure that your decisions are defensible. Somebody says, well, why did you do that in the first place? Well, here's my cost-benefit analysis. This is why I considered these other things. This is why I chose to do this. You want to allow smart allocation of scarce resources. These are all some obvious things, but it's the reason why we sometimes use lip service when we talk about cost-benefit analysis. Oh, yeah. Oh, what I really meant was I just considered a couple of other things, and I ended up doing what I figured I was going to do in the first place anyway. What we're saying here is, no kidding, really do an analysis of alternatives with cost-benefit analysis. Write it down. Talk about what those things are, so that you do have a defensible decision when you finally do decide. And this is actually a business requirement, so it's not like we're asking folks to do things that are extra and above what they're already being required to do. We're actually required to do this, but we often find ways to either cut the corners or not do it very well. The JROC, if you remember the JROC, for making decisions at a joint level, they're absolutely going to require it. You're going to go very, very deep if your program is being considered by the JROC. But as we talked about in an earlier module, the JROC doesn't consider everything, and lots of the things that we do are not going to go at the joint level. So just important to know. I think it's a good practice for us to get into. And last thing we want to touch on here before we end is some sort of a framework to think about return on investment, because this is going to be a big deal too. So not only are we estimating cost, looking at analysis of alternatives, but we should be thinking about a return on investment as a metric of financial success in these sorts of programs. So you're putting money in. This is an investment. What am I getting back? So you look at ROI equals savings minus investment divided by investment, where you got your baseline costs minus the alternatives costs, right? So you're looking at remember, we're making this analysis of alternatives. We're comparing things. So all of our costs are discounted, and I won't get into the net present value is a measurement that's used to discount those dollars over time. But you've got your cumulative return on investment over N years of a program that computes an annual return on investment. And this is all I'm really going to say about the net present value, is just how to compute it. But just know that because a lot of our procurements last over multiple years, you can't use a dollar figure in year one and assume that it's the same dollar figure in year N. So this is a way of modifying the cost of a dollar throughout the life cycle. You're looking at net present value, so that you can this is in essence, this is making sure that you're comparing apples to apples and nothing more. So just wrapping up, some bottom lines on cost-benefit analysis is this really does have high visibility for very obvious reasons. There's a high burden on labor and time to make sure that, this is where you ask anybody where most of their money goes to, even on a major like weapon system acquisition, it's people. People is typically going to be the most important and costly thing. So making sure you get your time right and your man hours right is going to be important. And there's lots of help available. There's a lot of folks who do this for a living, and they're a lot smarter than we are in how to do cost-benefit analysis, and we're good at what we do, and they're good at what they do, and we should be reaching out to the cost-benefit analysis folks to make sure that we are getting better estimates on our programs, because it just helps make us successful too. And that is our quick and dirty cost estimating and cost-benefit analysis briefing, adapted from Professor Nussbaum. Lots more to learn on this if anybody wants to dig deeper. It's a really important topic. In fact, we're actually finding more uses for modeling and simulation as a tool for doing cost-benefit analysis, and looking at simulation as a mechanism for looking at analysis of alternatives, applying costs, and helping to make those decisions for other acquisition programs throughout their life cycle. That's probably something to keep an eye on for the future, because I think it might be a big opportunity for modeling and simulation to play a role in acquisition itself.